evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Vanessa Riger. I am a professor in the politics department at Salem State University, and I am also the faculty fellow for research. And it is my pleasure to introduce and moderate today's webinar on implementing disability justice using intersectional and anti-oppressive approaches for helping professionals. This panel is the third and the last one in our series on disability justice. It was a series organized by the Center for Research and Creative Activities, as well as the Berry Library. And we're so excited that so many of you are able to join us tonight. Please note that this webinar is recorded, and you will be able to watch this webinar and the previous two webinars by visiting the library digital repository. We invite you to ask your questions in the Q&A box, and because of the time constraint, we will try to end at around 7 p.m. I apologize in advance if I am unable to get to your question, but we'll do our best to get to most of them. And finally, closed captioning is available by clicking on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So we have two fantastic speakers tonight, and I will briefly introduce them and pass over the microphone to them. So Dr. Lisa Johnson is an associate professor of social work here at Salem State University. Lisa has practiced in both the child welfare and healthcare fields and worked with systems for nonprofit development and community organizing. Her interests and area of personal and professional inquiry include child welfare, disability, equity and social justice, social work education, workforce development and leadership, and social work and the natural environment. Rose Singh is a PhD candidate at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador and a sessional lecturer at Dalhousie University. Rose is also a practicing social worker, and she brings over 2 decades of experience working in the social service sector with a focus on supporting youth and adults living with disabilities, mental health concerns, and substance use. Rose teaches courses on direct practice theory, social justice, and critical approaches to social work practice and policy in the areas of disability, mental health, and addictions. Rose's research and scholarship interests center on critical social work, education, social justice, disability justice, mental health, online learning and teaching, and emerging technologies. Thank you so much to both of you for being here tonight, and I will pass on the floor.
Thank you, Vanessa, and good evening, everyone. I am Lisa Johnson, and it is a pleasure to be with you and be presenting to you tonight. In way of a physical description of myself, I am a Black woman with deep brown skin. I am wearing eyeglasses this evening and a light pink turtleneck sweater. I have my hair pulled back in a bun, and I am wearing white earbuds, and I use she, her pronouns.
I'm Rose, and I'm honored to be here as well. A physical description of myself for those joining. I've got brown hair, white skin, wearing glasses, and a purple sweater, and also use she, her pronouns.
So tonight we're going to be speaking with you about implementing disability justice and using intersectional and anti-oppressive approaches for helping professionals. In terms of our presentation this evening, we will be touching on a very brief introduction to disability and disability justice. We will also talk about several theoretical and practice frameworks and employ a case example as a way to apply disability justice principles and the practice frameworks to practice. And we hope to leave a few moments at the end for questions.
I'll begin by giving an overview of disability. Prevalence in the United States is 27% of the US adult population, whereas in Canada, 22% of Canadians aged 15 and older live with disabilities. We also want to make a note about language. There's identity first language, which includes using the term disabled person, or person first language. An example of this is person with a disability. With language, it's really important to follow the lead of the disabled person. Note the language and terms they are using and respectfully ask if you're unsure or unclear. And in this presentation and generally in our work, we tend to use identity first language, such as disabled person. We'd also like to highlight the models of disability. Models of disability offer explanations on the individual experiences and socio-political contexts of disabled people and disability communities. The most common and influential are the medical and social models of disability. The medical model views disability as an individual problem and deficit and is rooted in the notion that there is an ideal or normal body and mind that is welcome and preferred in society. Disabled activists and theorists, such as Mike Oliver, named and developed the social model of disability in resistance to the medical model. And within the social model of disability, as Cameron writes, impairment is a condition or attribute, whereas disability is how society responded to or failed to respond to the needs of people with impairments. And on this slide, there's an image of a person who is a wheelchair user who's at the bottom of a set of stairs, and there's a sign on the stairs that states, "Weigh in, everyone welcome." On the left side of the image is a word bubble with the statement stating, "Her impairment is the problem. They should cure her or give her prosthetics." And on the right side of the image, there is a word bubble with the statement, "The stairs are the problem. They should build a ramp." And this image is attributed to the Cripping Social Work hashtag as adapted from Blue Stocking magazine. And the medical model understanding of their experiences states that they are the problem and the person should be rehabilitated or cured or treated, whereas the social model highlights the barriers the person experiences and that a ramp should be built rather than leaving the environment inaccessible for disabled people. The impacts of living with an impairment are acknowledged in the social model while highlighting the many systemic and structural factors that disregard and exclude disabled people and disability communities. And Mike Oliver himself noted that the social model of disability was not intended to be the only theorizing or model of disability, and encouraged an evolution of the social model as well as building new models and theorizing of disability. We'd also like to highlight other aspects of disability that are really important to situate disability within this conversation in the community. Throughout history and in modern day, disabled people and disability communities have experienced oppression and marginalization. And the specific term used to describe this oppression and marginalization towards disabled people and disability communities is ableism. Disability identity encompasses how a disabled person views themselves, their self-identification as a disabled person, their connections to disability culture and disability communities, their ways of interacting with and navigating the ableist context and society around them. Through the use of the term disability communities, there is acknowledgement of the diversity among disabled people and disability communities locally, nationally, and globally. It's also a distinct recognition of disability history, and the resistance through disability movements is also an important part of disability identity and disability culture. Disability resistance and movements are a result of the past to present day treatment of disabled people, which has included institutionalization, eugenics, incarceration, and broad exclusion from society. There was the disability civil rights movement in the 1960s onwards, which also led to the 1990 Americans with Disability Act, or ADA, which protects disabled people from discrimination. There's also the independent living movement that led to deinstitutionalization and more community inclusion. The disability justice movement began in 2005 and was led by a group of disabled, queer, and racialized activists who included Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, Leroy Moore, Stacey Milburn, Eli Clare, and Sebastian Margaret. And together they formed a framework and principles to guide their collective advocacy. From the Sins Invalid 2019 book, Skin, Tooth, and Bone, The Basis of Movement is Our People, on page 11, They describe their disability framework as understanding all bodies are unique and essential. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful, not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. And all bodies are confined by ability, race, gender, sexuality, class, nation, state, religion, and more, and we cannot separate them. And there's 10 disability justice principles that were created by these disabled activists who formed Sins Invalid. And these include intersectionality. Quoting Audre Lorde, "We do not live single issue lives. Ableism is coupled with white supremacy, supported by capitalism and underscored by heteropatriarchy, and has rendered the vast majority of the world invalid." There's also the principle of the leadership of the most impacted. And to quote Morales, "We are led by those who know most of these systems." And there's anti-capitalist politics. And in an economy that sees land and humans as components of profits, disability justice is anti-capitalist by the nature of having non-conforming bodies and minds. There's also a commitment to cross-movement organizing, shifting how social justice movements understand disability and contextualizes ableism. That disability justice lends itself to the politics of alliance. There's also recognizing wholeness, that people have inherent worth outside of commodity relations and capitalist notions of productivity and worth, and each person is full of history and life experience. The disability justice principle of sustainability, which means pacing ourselves individually and collectively to be sustained over the long term, and that our embodied experiences guide us toward ongoing justice and liberation. There's a commitment to cross-disability solidarity, honoring the insights and participation of all community members, knowing that isolation undermines collective liberation, and the principle of interdependence, that meeting each other's needs is crucial as we build towards liberation. Also, collective access, which centers Black, Indigenous, and queer disabled people's experiences and access needs. And collective liberation, that no body or mind can be left behind, and only moving together that we can accomplish the revolution we require. And to summarize, drawing on the work of Sami Schalk, disability justice centers the insights, knowledges, voices, and experiences of the disabled people and communities most oppressed, past, present.
Now we will briefly go over theory and practice frameworks that can support implementing disability justice principles in our practice as helping professionals. They are critical cultural competence, intersectionality, and anti-oppressive practice. The concept of cultural competence is familiar to practitioners in a variety of helping disciplines. Cultural competence supports our focus on working effectively across cultures. Critical cultural competence is an enhancement of this in that it focuses on knowledge and behaviors that support effective cross-cultural engagement, as well as the harnessing of these knowledge and behaviors for policy and social change. Critical cultural competence also highlights the dynamic nature of culture, the fact that culture in and of itself is changeable, and that individuals' experiences of culture, personal experiences, can be fluid. Critical cultural competence also helps us recognize the need for an ongoing commitment to self-evaluation, as well as an ongoing commitment to knowledge and skill development. It promotes attention to power imbalances in relationships and in the environment. And most importantly for our conversation tonight, we can think of it as being useful in supporting acknowledgement of positive elements of disability and disability culture, and in helping us to critique ableist systems and structures. Intersectionality is another concept that is likely familiar and has been utilized more and more in many academic and professional settings, especially within the last few years. It is an idea that has been around for a much longer time, though, and it's rooted primarily in the writing and thinking of women of color, such as Anna Julia Cooper, Bell Hooks, the Combahee River Collective, Gloria Anzaldúa, and Kimberly Crenshaw. Intersectionality or an intersectional perspective views social identities and the experiences of privilege and oppression based on these identities as interlocking and interdependent. It's a way of understanding and examining the complexities of human interactions with one another, with institutions, and with the larger society. An intersectional perspective looks at each person's particular social location as a combination of their personal identity and their social identities. It allows for a more comprehensive appreciation and understanding of individual and community experiences because it helps us take into account multiple interdependent identities and avoid seeing people as one-dimensional. Finally, anti-oppressive practice. With a more recent introduction in the US, anti-oppressive practice traces its development from radical and structural social work and other helping professions in Canada, critical social work in Australia, and anti-racism and anti-discriminatory care work in Britain. By building on numerous progressive frameworks, anti-oppressive practice is positioned as a transformative approach to helping professions and care work. Anti-oppressive practice centers on recognizing and challenging power and oppression. It helps us move beyond only focusing on individual level problems of people accessing services to consider personal, cultural, and structural levels of oppression, such as ableism, racism, ageism, and sexism. Anti-oppressive practice promotes us raising our consciousness and doing so in a critical way, which is the ongoing process of critically reflecting and analyzing one's values, biases, worldview, as well as the shifting of power dynamics to support empowerment of communities, especially historically marginalized communities that we may be engaging with as helping professionals. We can use anti-oppressive practice framework as a way to deconstruct dominant notions of disability, as a way to push back against stereotypes of disabled people. And we can target barriers to inclusion of disabled people. And we can also affirm disability identities and experiences.
So keep in mind the disability justice principles in these practice frameworks as we discuss our case example next. The image on this slide is of circles overlapping and forming a Venn diagram. The three larger circles contain the theory and practice frameworks of critical cultural competence, intersectionality, and anti-oppressive practice, and the smaller inner circle contains disability justice. And we'll be using a more social work focused case example in which a clinical social worker is working with a client over a period of weeks. But we encourage you to think about how this might apply to your own context with the people you work with, whether they be students, patients, service users, groups, or communities.
So in this case example, we're going to be meeting Josie and Regina. Josie is a licensed clinical social worker, and she receives a referral to work with a new client, Regina. Josie's based in an outpatient mental health center and is tasked with providing Regina with counseling and support to address challenges she is facing with family members and work colleagues. Given that some of the agency's work with clients has shifted to remote since the pandemic, Josie is primarily using a telehealth platform to connect with Regina. The case file Josie reviews includes an intake form filled out by Regina and records from the agency's previous involvement in Regina's life. Josie notes that Regina identifies as a Black woman and that she grew up in a rural area in Western Massachusetts where her family has lived for generations. Josie reads that Regina is a high school graduate who tries to maintain a balance between being able to engage in meaningful work that does not put receipt of her healthcare benefits at risk in order to manage the care she needs for her disability, which is identified as autism. Josie herself identifies as a white cisgender woman who is non-disabled. As we move through this case and talk about things we will consider, we'll discuss several steps or phases and considerations at each of these steps or phases. And we'll think about how we might actually apply the theory and practice frameworks as well as disability justice principles at each phase. So prior to meeting for the first time, we have the opportunity to engage in both reflective and reflective practices. Essentially, what this means is that we can keep in mind our theories and practice frameworks, as well as the disability justice principles, and use those to prompt us to reflect on our own social identities, our own positions within the social order, our own worldviews, and our knowledge. We can then think about how we might apply these understandings to our practice decisions and our behaviors. We can also recognize that there are likely limits to our current knowledge, whether they be about the particular person or group that we'll be working with, or about the case situation or the broader context. And we can use this time and opportunity to seek out additional information. We can think of this as a pre-engagement phase, pre-engagement reflection and action. And this helps us think about what we may need to consider or do prior to engaging in work with our clients, our students, our patients, et cetera. And this might be done, for example, during the days before the first office meeting after a case is assigned, or in the summer before starting a new school year, or in the break before a new semester, or whenever there's an opportunity to think specifically or more generally about how one can practice intersectionally, competently, and justly, either with a specific client or with our clients or students or patients in general. And so in this case situation, Josie takes the opportunity before she meets with Regina to reflect. And she asks herself about her understanding of disability, of autism, of broader disability culture. She uses this opportunity if there's something that she feels she needs to explore further to access information through books, videos, other resources. She may use colleagues at work as resources.
So when beginning this work, there's also some additional considerations to keep in mind. So this would be the point where Josie and Regina would be meeting each other. And so if you were to consider this more broadly for the context that you may be working in, this would include an opportunity to learn from the client or the patient or the student or the service user that you're working with. Specifically, for example, about their cultures, their identities. Think about how you might connect across cultures and the different roles that you have. And really important is, how can you develop goals together? So in doing this work and starting this work, Josie acknowledges the differences and the commonalities that may influence how she works with Regina. Josie respectfully asks Regina what is important to her and for her around identity, culture, and what is it that Regina would like to work on. And as they continue this work together, there's the phase of exploring strengths and needs. So in your context, again, considering the many different contexts you might be working in, this can include centering the client's narrative about what's going on, what they think needs to be changed, what tools or resources are available to help. Also, to go back to the frameworks that we've included and draw on specific skills related to critical cultural competence, anti-oppressive practice, self-reflection to inform how you'll work together. Be aware of how social norms, agency policies, or laws may influence understandings of the problems presented and potential solutions posed. And identifying circles of support and the potential for respecting the dignity of risk. So this is the right to take risks when going through life and its various experiences. And dignity of risk is fundamental for disabled people, as many do not have a voice in regards to their life circumstances and were and still often are viewed as unable to make decisions for themselves. And the specific application of these considerations for Josie and Regina is Josie is mindful of the level of cultural sensitivity of the agency mandated clinical assessment tools she's required to use, and make sure to integrate critical perspectives with the information gained from these clinical tools she uses. Josie also invites Regina to explain the situation in her own words and encourages her to connect with friends that she has through the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network.
So after thinking about what strengths and needs are present, essentially an assessment type of phase, you might enter a phase where you're actually doing the work together, engaging in the intervention, or engaging in the treatment, or actually making or implementing the change that you're working on together as a client or student or patient and helping professional. And in this phase, it's important to think about how, as you move through the work together, you're continuing to support the concept of dignity, of risk, and self-determination to the extent possible, as well as supporting the use of circles of support, such as Regina's friends in the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. You might also be thinking about how we might foster inclusion, community inclusion, both through integrating the disabled person into the larger society and thinking about how society in microform, right? So perhaps the family context, the work context, the neighborhood context itself can be changed. And another consideration during this phase is remembering nothing about us without us. And this is important to the disability rights and disability justice movements, as it's a call from disabled people for radical inclusion, for a place at the table, for a voice, and oftentimes a lead voice in the conversation about what is to happen. In Josie and Regina's work together, Josie checks in with Regina, even as they are starting their work, to determine how they will know when their goals have been met and services are no longer needed. So they're looking toward independence. They're looking toward allowance for risk. Josie also makes sure to weave in the intervention approaches that recognize both Regina's desire to more fully integrate into her work and family environments, as well as the ways that these environments may need to be adjusted, changed to be more inclusive and more affirming of Regina and other disabled people. So she works one-on-one with Regina to support this inclusion. But as they work together, Josie can also be a part of supporting Regina in her own advocacy efforts, perhaps such that she feels increasingly more comfortable to advocate to her family and her manager at work around neurodiversity acceptance. And how might the workplace itself make changes such that they are thinking structurally about how they could promote more inclusive and affirming practices. Next, we'll think about starting to bring the working relationship to some sort of close. We might think about this as concluding or terminating the working relationship. And it's important here to keep in mind that there may be issues of power dynamics that may arise about how and when services are ended. And this can especially be the case when services are involuntary. We also, once again, need to continue to affirm connections with circles of support and honor the dignity of risk. In our example, Josie and Regina take this opportunity to be collaborative and collaborate together. Josie ensures that Regina's voice is heard around the process of ending the relationship, the working relationship, and agreeing on follow-up as needed and as appropriate, keeping the dignity of risk and connection with circles of support in mind. And as the working relationship concludes and as, or even after, it's important to think about evaluation. It's important to think about how did it go? And keeping in mind a centering of the clients or the students or the patients' narrative or story of their own experience with the process and the outcome, and keeping in mind an intersectional lens while doing this. How did their various identities and perspectives come into play? How were they honored or not honored? It's also important to think about how can we share some of this information, this story, this narrative with perhaps the larger organization or agency to think about how we might improve practice with disability communities. And so in our example, Josie and Regina work together as they bring their relationship to a close to refer back to what they talked together about how they would identify success and to determine, was it successful? And Josie listens to Regina's perspective on this. Josie might also invite Regina to share her perspective or receive approval from Regina to share findings with the agency or even beyond about the insights that she gained to inform disability affirming changes.
So let's revisit our image of the 4 circles encompassing the frameworks we've discussed and with disability justice in the center. And let's also reconnect our case example to disability justice, critical cultural competence, intersectionality, and anti-oppressive practice, specifically coming back to the disability justice principles and the practice frameworks to reiterate how they have guided Josie's micro and meso level So whether individual or family and group practice, and how they might also guide her at the macro level, whether that be community, organizationally, or socially based, and that engagement. So let's consider Josie's work around implementing these practice frameworks we've discussed and disability justice at the individual or group level. So intersectionality, remembering intersectionality as its own theoretical lens and practice, and as one of the 10 disability justice principles, with a specific recognition of how ableism, racism, sexism, and heterosexism interact to marginalize, oppress, and exclude Black, Indigenous, and racialized disabled people and communities. And recognizing wholeness, this disability justice principle asks Josie to challenge capitalist ideas around worth and productivity that she may carry, and instead consider how and the many ways that disabled people contribute to communities and society, and to think about how this relates to Regina and Regina's hopes and dreams. And also the disability justice principle of collective access, which centers Black, Indigenous, and queer disabled people's experiences and access needs, and being flexible and creative to make this happen in practice and in the places Regina goes. Josie can help implement this by viewing requests for access as a strength and as crucial to creating and building community. And let's connect this to the organizational or community or society levels as well. So the principle of leadership of the most impacted, this disability justice principle asks us to elevate, listen to, read, follow, and highlight the perspectives of those who are most impacted by harmful systems. For example, in Josie's workplace or other organizations she may be affiliated with, how are Black, Indigenous, racialized, or queer disabled people represented in decision-making and leadership? And if not, what actions will Josie take to ensure this is brought to the team and made a priority? Sustainability. This disability justice principle reminds us to pace and sustain ourselves through this activist work. How does Josie ensure she does not ask too much of and overextend or exploit the disabled people most impacted? What learning and work can she do that does not involve drawing time and energy from the disabled people most impacted? And interdependence. This disability justice principle reminds Josie that she can help to ensure needs as defined by disabled people are met, and recognize that this does not need to occur only through state-run solutions, as these can limit and control. This disability justice principle also extends to our interconnectedness as living beings on this planet and the liberation of the earth from human harms. Josie can consider how she can practice in a way that honors the requests of disabled people and their identified needs. Josie can also think about how her social work practice can become more respectful of the environment and of the planet.
So as we move toward wrapping up our talk this evening, we invite you to consider checking out some further reading in works by leading disabled activists and authors. And some are websites, and one is a book. So from Alice Wong, we have disabilityvisibilityproject.com. From Eli Clare, we have eliclaire.com. Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasina. You can check out brownstargirl.org. Sammy Schock's book, Black Disability Politics, is also worth a read. And you can learn more about the disability justice principles from Sens Invalid at sensinvalid.org. So that concludes our prepared materials, and we would be happy to hear from you regarding questions or comments you may have.
Thank you so much, Rose and Lisa, for a wonderful presentation. There already is actually a question in the Q&A box, which I am going to read. I have never heard about the dignity of risk. Can you explain that concept a bit more? And do you have any specific resources to recommend to learn more?
Rose, I'll defer to you if that's okay.
Sure.
And then I'll follow up. Yeah.
I think we can probably both add to this.
Yeah.
So as I shared, and it did come up a couple times or a few times in our presentation, it's particularly important for disabled people because of the lack of voice and input and control a lot of disabled people have had in their lives and continue. So when you think about institutionalization, no input on your life, right? So when we talk about the history of disability and disability communities, how people have been impacted in a way to not have a voice, not have a say in their decisions and in their lives. So an example that I think of from practice around dignity of risk, and you will see literature on this as well, is around, say, someone's decision to use substances. So this also relates to harm reduction, right? So if you're, I realize I might be speaking to a slightly different practice context in my coming from Canada, but you know, if, for example, if someone decides to use substances, that it links to both dignity of risk and also potentially harm reduction, right? So how might you work with someone, depending on your practice role, around respecting their decision to use substances and also to do so in a way that potentially reduces harm.
Great, thank you so much. So another encouragement to ask your questions in the Q&A box, and I will be reading them to our panelists. Another question is, how do you use disability justice personally in your practice?
Okay, I can start with this one. And I also want to quickly follow up on Rose's very good response regarding dignity of risk. And again, highlighting, I think, the issue that oftentimes disabled folks are infantilized. And so in similar situations where someone who is non-disabled may be expected or allowed, right, to make self-determining choices, it may be that a person with disability is not given the same dignity of allowance to make that choice simply based on their disability, right, and not necessarily because of other factors at play. And so that dignity of risk really helps us think about how we are not being ableist in treating disabled people differently or discriminating against disabled people just by virtue of their disability. I think in terms of how I've tried to think about employing disability justice in my practice, for me, these principles feel like a touchstone almost, right? Something that I need to continue to go back to and to remind myself about and be reminded of. I think it also helps me think about how I create space. And as my current practice is as an educator, right, a social work educator. And so a lot of the thinking I do is about how I set up my classes, about how I set up my content, about how I may think about things intersectionally. And so I find myself employing these principles in a prospective way, but also as I'm in conversation and collaboration with other people, thinking about am I promoting collective sort of access and action, or am I falling back onto the ableist socialization that I've experienced? Rose, I don't know if you also have a response to this one.
Yeah, I can add. I think what's really important with disability justice and disability justice principles is we don't lose sight of what Sins Invalid intended as well. And this often comes with different frameworks and theoretical perspectives, including intersectionality, closely linked to disability justice, that as much as possible, really staying true to what was intended and what continues to evolve from the leaders, the disability activists who formed and created Sins Invalid, and also others that we have mentioned too, that we don't lose those original meanings and intentions in that work is really important to me. I think also recognizing that I often work in contradictory spaces. So as much as I want to hold true to maybe anti-capitalist politics, if I'm working in an organization that is very informed by, neoliberal policies, there's going to be a contradiction as much as I might want to be anti-capitalist, that if I'm working in a setting and I'm getting, a wage from working there, there's going to be a contradiction as well. So I have to as much stay true to these principles and practices and frameworks, while also being very upfront and aware of where do I have these contradictions.
Great, thank you so much.
I think that's an excellent point. And I also want to say that I think that prompts me to also help us keep in mind, there's no such thing as perfection. And that even in our case example, sort of a lot of the things we talked about, we also have to keep in mind the potential that we're often working in these contradictory spaces, or that our efforts may barriers may be placed in front of our efforts, right, by potential lack of resources, or sometimes our own challenges in being able to keep these standards and these ideals in front of us. And so really it's mostly about trying to hold ourselves accountable, hold each other accountable, do the very best we can to continue to strive toward, right, using an intersectional lens and using anti-oppressive practices as much as possible, knowing that there will be days where we make mistakes, right, where we can't always reach there fully. But I think it's in the striving and in continuing to strive that some good work can be done.
And to add on that, Lisa, like I really think, and this probably comes back to conversations we've had around, there's a lot that you can do, right? So when you think about the disability justice principles that speak to about cross movement organizing and support, yeah. Right, we can acknowledge the contradictions, but we also want to acknowledge that what we can do.
Excellent, thank you so much. Another great question in the chat. Do you see a difference in the public or political perception of disability rights when comparing the United States and Canada?
That's a really great question. I think we've talked a bit about it. I think it's certainly informed sort of in terms of some different policies. I sort of go back to our conversation about, for instance, the anti-oppressive practice perspective, which is a perspective that we don't learn about as much here in the US, and that hasn't come to the fore as much, where I see and have heard from Rose and others that being much more embedded in education and in practice in the Canadian context. And so, and we also know that in thinking about the social model of disability, a lot of that work came out from outside of the US context. And so I think that there are some ways in which in terms of civil rights and in terms of action, that we as sort of a US system have a lot to learn from other systems by virtue of policy and theory. But Rose, I think from your perspective, I wonder too if you have some thoughts on this.
I would, from if I had to speak generally about what's going on in Canada, which I'm not a huge fan of generalizing, but I am, will make a bit of a generalization here, is that there has been some promising legislation coming through in different provinces. However, even with that legislation in place, that fundamentally there needs to be a shift societally around disability and specifically ableism. That even with some, like I said, some promising legislation coming into place in different, it's not in all provinces, but different provinces, that there's still a lot of ableism embedded in so many ways, whether it's personal interactions, whether it's more systemically or structurally, environmental setups, access, accessibility, that we have a lot of work to do.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. So you shared this amazing list of resources at the end of your presentation, but are there, in addition, disability advocates, especially those working in human services, you might recommend others learning more about?
Yeah, absolutely. A person who I think of as Vilissa Thompson, and Vilissa Thompson's a clinical social worker, a disability rights consultant, activist, writer. She founded Ramp Your Voice, which is an organization focused on promoting self-advocacy and empowerment among disabled people. I also think of Leroy Moore, who is author of a book called Black Disabled Ancestors. And that I think is really important as well in thinking about sort of the history of disability communities and activism and empowerment. And Leroy Moore founded Crip Hop Nation. And so it's using hip hop as a way of self-expression for people with disabilities. And so those are a couple of folks that come to mind, I think, who are engaged in disability justice work. And I would put before you to consider checking out more. Rose, I don't know if you have others you might add.
I was just also thinking here in Ontario to check out the work of the Disability Justice Network of Ontario and some incredible activists here as well. And the lead organizer, Sarah Jama, just recently got elected into the Ontario legislature. So It's very exciting.
That seems to be all the questions that we have received. So unless there's a last minute question in the chat, and it doesn't seem to be. So I just want to thank you so much, our presenter, for really this terrific introduction to the topic. There's so much more to learn, but you've shared some resources with us. And again, this webinar was recorded, so you will be able to see a recording in a few days by visiting the Salem State Library digital repository. So thank you again to all of you who attended. Have a good night. And, again, thanks. This was wonderful. This was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.